Hello, and welcome to week 5 of 1619, The Making of America, a 400-year history. This week we're talking about race and health, and I have with me John Monroe, who's agreed to be my kind of co-discussant on this week's reading. And we're taking up Raina Hogarth's piece on the persistence of kind of racialized or medicalized ideas of race, particularly surrounding Black bodies. And so please join us for this walk as we get into this piece. Ready?
Traveling theory, as it were.
Yes.
And that was kind of nice having the train just rolling by. So this is real. We're here.
Hopefully it works out and you can hear us. It'll be great.
Yeah. Can I start by asking you a question?
Sure.
So this is a wonderful piece. It's short. It does a lot in just a few pages. Why did you assign it?
Because I wanted to think about race and health. I think that the one way that you think about race and health in the U.S. is often kind of refracted through the prism of disparity. So we think about, one of the most often quoted ones is the maternal death rate of Black women and it being inordinately high. The kind of disproportionate rate with which Black people suffer from diabetes and that being disproportionately high. And oftentimes that comes back to kind of particularities of Black bodies. It's not thinking about racism. It's not thinking about the structural inequalities that would make anyone who faced those kinds of circumstances more susceptible to disease. And so I really wanted students to kind of have a piece that really laid out the stakes really clearly. And really to think through how that works, how that reasoning works. And I thought that she does a good job with that.
As did I, and thank you. This was my introduction to Professor Hogarth's work. So, I mean, it's also just a wonderful, and for the students to think about this too, a wonderful model of writing. Look at that very first sentence that tells you that the piece is going to be looking at the persistence of these ideas of, supposedly innate differences between Black and white people in the United States. It just, it's very nice to see that modeled. And you can imagine this professor working with this sort of, for historians, we like to go on at length often, right?
Yeah.
And so to know you had such a small amount of space to work with, you can imagine the strategy. I need to make it crystal clear, essentially in the first sentence, what I'm doing here, and this just does that so perfectly before then moving on to also in a very clear fashion sort of saying the way in which this is going to work out. So as a historian of the 20th century, for me, this is delving far back in time, and I know you work on later periods too, but you work on a bit of an earlier time than me. So it's also interesting that this brings us back to the 18th century.
Yeah, and thinking about, and I think one of the things that's really interesting, right, is the way in which these things that begin in the 18th century still reverberate today, right? So thinking about, we're in the midst of COVID.
Yeah.
When COVID, first you got your first cases in Alabama, there were discussions that Black people didn't get it.
Yeah, right.
That it was a disease that was more susceptible for whites, or that if they did get it, they were going to recover quickly. And so when I was reading this piece, it was just so reminiscent to me, of just debates that we were just having. That was quickly disproven. We now know that, because of structural inequalities in the health system, that not only are Black people getting COVID in the U.S., but they are dying at a very high rate.
Yeah. And what an excellent parallel to the 1619 project then, even though this piece in particular isn't talking about COVID, that both very much look at a historical moment, the 1790s, 1619 obviously, and are at all moments thinking about the connection to the present. For me that raises an issue of, okay, this is maybe slightly tangent, but I'm curious what you think about this too. So, in some kinds of training in history, presentism is a sort of is a sin. You shouldn't do that. It's extrapolating our present onto the past and this kind of thing. Maybe I'll ask you what you think about presentism. I have real opinions about this, but maybe I'll ask you first what you think. What do you think about presentism as a charge? It certainly could be leveled against 1619, though they would answer that very easily, I think.
Yeah.
But what do you think about presentism?
I use it a lot to teach it's very much part of my pedagogy. I always tell my students that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Yeah, of course.
And I think if you're trying to understand systems, really, it's really useful to think about the kind of present day manifestations of that.
Yeah.
And so I want my scholarship to not be teleological. So I'm not trying to get to the endpoint,
Yeah.
right? And you know, starting from the endpoint to explain the past.
Yeah.
But I think that if you can look to the present, and nothing's going to be exactly the same, right? But I think that if you can look to these kind of historical examples to see those kinds of rhyming patterns or reverberations, I think that in my experience, it always hits home more. I think it's a more lasting question, because sometimes, you know, 18th century is very hard to get in touch with. You know, you're like, where did yellow fever? What? But I think that COVID is more immediate for people. You can look, right?
Yeah.
And you might have lived through these examples. And so so for me, I think presentism can be particularly useful in terms of trying to tease out and really understand some of these big kind of systems at play in society.
Wow, that's really useful for me. So students, I'm actually kind of a student in this moment too, because I'm learning as well, because that is a really useful way for me to think about it. My thinking on presentism, maybe unsurprisingly, is more crude. I'm just not very interested in it. I'm interested in it as an idea, and this kind of conversation shows that, of course. I'm not interested in it as an accusation. You know, guilty as charged. I live in the present. This is the moment through which I look at the past, and politics of the moment are a hugely important motivator for me to want to do this work. And I feel like. But then I feel like it's crude in the sense of, you know, then I don't try to think a bit more, like what you just said was so useful, to think a bit more with that, not just to say, okay, presentism is not an accusation that I'm very interested in thinking about in that sense, but actually thinking about it in the sense that you're talking about how, well, it's still, just because it's okay to think about the present and the past at the same time, there's still more that's required of us. And again, your sort of quotation of I think it was Twain, what is it again? It rhymes.
History doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Exactly. Is really useful here. So that's nice. And this piece is just so good at doing that too. Like we get a sense that this past matters for the present, but also it's not teleological.
Right. And I think too, if you think about one of the things that the 1619 Project does really well is you often, you know, see these kind of critiques of, you know, Black political organizing as, you know, these things are done, like, you know, get over it. And I think the Hogarth piece, but also 1619, shows that actually no, that people are still very much living through the consequences of what we thought was a very outmoded way of thinking. And that it was not a kind of legacy of I think Hogarth, you know, uses the word of a bygone past, that this is very much in our day-to-day of the present. And so I think there's no way to have that conversation without the present, you know?
No, I think this is of course right. It does bring me to something that I did have a little bit of a criticism of in the piece, actually, or well, we'll see if it's a criticism or not, but something that gave me pause, which was the way that she words that move in the argument to say that these, extremely racist ideas were not only pro-slavery, or not only a product of the system of slavery. And of course, I'm entirely on board with that mode of argument. And she shows it so well within the piece itself, that some anti-slavery figures also, of course, were working within and furthering this very discourse. But at the same time, just the way that she words that, where she says that something along the lines of sort of like perhaps too much focus on slavery is a problem because it associates these ideas with slavery. Yes, but I also feel at the same time that it's not possible to focus too much on slavery. It's too foundation. It's too important, and so on. I can take a turn holding the camera if you want. What do you think of that?
So I think. I think that like the wording, I wouldn't have used those words. I think what she's trying to say is that when people think about racial science in particular, I think more people are willing to accept that racism is enduring. But I think that people think that like bad science is temporary. and that scientists are a professional class and they're self-correcting.
Yeah.
And so that we will get to a better, that the science is always getting better.
Yes.
And that science is value neutral.
Yes.
And so I think that her point about slavery was that when we tie the racial science to a particular moment of racism, because that particular period is done, the science is now not implicated.
Yeah.
But what she's saying is we need to focus on the thoughts and the science, because that's the thing that keeps going.
Yeah. That's very good. That sort of puts it in a conversation with Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that challenges this idea of science always moving in this kind of like progress from, I don't know, more ignorance to knowing better or something. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and it's very, it reminds me of the eugenics movement, right? Which is another thing that we're going to talk about this week. Is, people are quick to defeat the eugenics movement as this kind of like pseudoscience. They're like, yeah, there wasn't a lot of people who I think everyone who was anyone was a eugenicist.
Yeah. It was science.
Yeah, it was science. It was a completely legitimate way of seeing and thinking that has since fallen in disrepute, but in some segments, but there's still like a vibrant eugenics society.
Yeah.
And they have conferences, So I think that that point there was about really interrogating these kinds of ideas of medical thought and not allowing these institutions to be beyond reproach or question.
Yeah. That's definitely right. And it's one of the things I love about the piece too is, if you think about, maybe you would periodize this more accurately than me, if I think about sort of the high point of eugenics, I think more sort of, what would you say is sort of the era?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm a long eugenicist. So I believe that it starts in the late 19th century, but I don't think that it leaves after World War II. I think that we continue to see reverberations of it into the present.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to be very careful, particularly around the ways in which reproductive politics are manifest in the U.S. court system.
Yeah.
Around people, who have drug dependencies,
yeah,
or who are impoverished, or who even have too many children. The way in which those have been rolled out, that's very reminiscent of eugenics.
Right. That was a loud train, but I think I heard you, because what you're saying is really important, and what a challenge that is to this notion. It's such a commonly received notion that eugenics died with the Nazis.
Yes. Yes.
And so to think about that and think about the differences there are really important. How you guys doing?
Hello.
Hey.
You filming a vlog? A vlog?
No, it's for class.
Yeah.
It's for class.
Yeah. We're teaching a class.
Zoom.
Yeah.
Online classroom.
Yeah,
Can you put me in the online classroom? Hello. Are they there?
Well, they will be.
It will be.
Make sure you lot stay in school. School's very important. Now, university, innit? Stay in university. It'll get you somewhere in life. Go in university. Get you somewhere in life. Get a degree and get a job.
Thanks, guys. See you later. How nice. I mean, this is one of the things about teaching outside, right?
Cameos.
Yeah, wonderful.
Those were sweet boys.
Wonderful.
I'm very much, and I think you'll see people who are like, well, you lose the kind of widespread acceptance, and that eugenics ceases to be palatable. And I think also too, one of the things that people don't appreciate, eugenics starts in Britain. It's imported to the U.S. As with many things, we perfect it, and then it's picked up by the Nazis. Like people also too. One of the things that allows eugenics to kind of fade into the background but still be to be nefarious and dangerous is that you have this new history that it was invented by the Nazis, but that is not the case.
Yeah.
It's really, really perfected in its most dangerous senses by Americans.
Right. Right.
So, yeah. But I was wondering, like, what you think about, when you think about certain diseases and you think about like disparity, how should we be thinking about how to talk sensitively about these issues in a way that doesn't fall back on pathologizing?
Yeah, of course. I mean, my short answer would be by keeping our eyes on the structures in which these disparities play out, which again, I think this piece is teaching us to do. And it makes me think of, there's a sociologist whose work is really great on this, and students may want to look her up, Ingrid Waldron, who works on social determinants of health, and also through a lens of environmental racism. But her work is really amazing at holding sort of the varieties of structures together at once. Anti-Black racism, of course, but also settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, the different dimensions. And I feel like one way to stay clear of any kind of danger of pathology is to keep our eyes focused there.
Yes, yeah. No, I do agree. And I think too, one of the things, I would encourage the students to do, and we'll be talking about this week, is, thinking about race as a historical category rather than like an attribute of bodies. And I think if we could think about what one of the kind of common occurrences that we're so quick to think about, we're still tethered to some degree to the reality of race, because so many ways of speaking and thinking and making sense of the world is centered around kind of racial constructs and racial systems.
Yeah.
And so I think for me that's one of the ways to do that, because I think what people really miss sometimes too is the way in which physicians make shorthand out of your racial categories.
Right.
If you present with a heart issue or high blood pressure, then you automatically become a kind of predisposed to diabetes, when in reality if you're from the continent, you're not gonna face diabetes at the same rate as someone who's born in the United States, right?
Right.
But even if you both are residing in the U.S.
Yeah, of course.
Right, and so nation, your access to, like you said, systems that determine health outcomes, that's what's really important.
Yeah, and again, as we see in the article, in the case of I don't know if we might call it a willful misdiagnosis, but around the yellow fever case, this is kind of what happened, right? Mm-hmm. That people's location in terms of where they were before they were being, examined, I guess.
Yeah.
Didn't come into play, and therefore was one of the foundations of this. I mean, we can call it a mistake, but it's also, I feel like in some ways, I'd be interested to hear what you would say about this too, in that it's a mistake, but in that it is of such service to a system of racial slavery, and also a system of racism even for those whites opposed to slavery. To call it a mistake seems kind of like, well, that's not exactly, I'm very uncomfortable with, I use the term, but I don't think it's the right one.
So that's absolutely right. And this week we're going to be talking about the Tuskegee experiment. What's interesting about that is that many of the physicians and the public health service were racial liberals of their time, but they still thought that it was necessary to carry out a study on the differential exposure and treatment of syphilis in American blacks.
Right.
Right, so that you can be liberal, quote unquote, and still fall into these trappings. One thing that you should look up Bidil. So Bidil is the first race-based medicine. It was
which is mentioned in the article. Yeah.
So it's this pill that rolled out, I think, around 2010, and it's marketed as particularly effective in Black Americans for the treatment of high blood pressure. But what happened is the only reason they decided to do that was because the FDA patent was running out, and they needed to renew the patent, but the justification on which the patent was going to be renewed was no longer legitimate. So then they claimed it to be something more effective, but the whole thing was fabricated.
Right.
But at the same time, you had lots of African American physicians who took up Bidil as the kind of pill for their clients, for their patients.
Right.
And so I think for me, Bidil raises a lot of questions about the kind of fine line between being the kind of subject of medical research for these kind of nefarious reasons, but also unintentionally perpetuating that because you want to be present in medical research.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So that most of these studies about disease, they don't feature Black Americans.
Right.
Or dark skin for that matter.
Right.
So then how do you make sure that you are represented so that doctors can treat you better, but how do you also resist, essentializing Black health in these ways. So it's really interesting tensions that I think the piece raises.
Yeah, exactly. And also in the context of, the pharmaceutical industry here as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a great piece. That was really, of course, yet another good call on your part assigning it.
Thank you.
And the other just thing I was going to say is I also like that it didn't go, like eugenics would be the kind of like more, in some ways, easier move to make, but it goes back to an earlier case to show us, in keeping with the 1619 Project, that these longer histories are, really, really compel our attention.
Yes. I think that's absolutely right. And so I really hope that you enjoy the Hogarth piece and it really leads you to some interesting reflections on the continuation of these ideas in American thought.
See you later.